Hi guys, welcome back aboard good old Athena. We're ready to start our Atlantic crossing, but we're stuck in a little bit of a sailor's dilemma. While we figure out our little dilemma, I can put myself and my two new swashbuckling crew members to work. I've got a couple of projects in mind. My name is Mess, this is my wife Ava. I've spent the last 5 years on a somewhat extensive refit of our 1987 Warrior 38 named Athena. That was a DIY fun-packed adventure complete with a very extensive osmosis treatment, building a new rudder using vacuum infusion, rebuilding the entire deck, gutting and subsequently rebuilding most of the interior, painting the top sides, and a ton of other projects. The summer of 2021 we started cruising full time. Now we're finally ready to begin our adventure. I mentioned our little sailor's dilemma. That dilemma is as follows. It would be nice to leave as quick as possible, but it would also be nice to have the most comfortable passage possible, or at least start of the passage. Don't get me wrong, it is nice here in the Canary Islands, but I've been here for a month and the boat is basically ready to go. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of lumpy weather in our way. It's not horrible weather, it's just a little bit lumpy. It's this yellow mess here, that's 25 sustained, gusting 36. So it's not horrible, but I would like for us to have a nice easy start to the passage so that everybody gets to be familiar with the boat and just have an easy start. The Atlantic crossing from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean is about 2,700 miles. For a boat like Athena, that should take about-ish 3 weeks, and the weather forecast only covers 9 days. So we won't know what we'll get during the passage once we've left, but I think there is a lot to be said for an easy start. It is very easy once you've been stuck somewhere for a while to get a case of the let's just get the heck out of here-itis. But we're in no real rush. We can afford to postpone our departure 4 to 6 days. And if we do that, we're leaving in much more settled weather, and looking at this, it looks like we might even get a little bit of spinnaker weather for flying our newly found spinnaker. Looking at the weather for the foreseeable future, it doesn't seem like we'll have a dead downwind start to our passage, so we have decided to remove the second headsail from our furler. I'm still really excited about the two poled out headsail setup for dead downwind sailing, so fingers crossed we'll get a chance to put it back up. With the current forecast, it looks like Saturday or Sunday would be a good option to leave. So that means we have 3 or 4 days to do some boat work. To be able to go up the mast if our spinnaker gets stuck up there, Mark suggested adding essentially a second spinnaker halyard so that we have something to use as a safety line. Normally I would use the mainsail halyard and then the spinnaker halyard as a safety line, but if the spinnaker halyard is in use, then that won't work. While messing around with that, Mark suggested that we also swap a couple of lines and replace one of them with a longer line that we can lead aft to the cockpit to use the electric winch to hoist someone up the mast. That means Ava will easily be able to get me up the mast in case we ever have to do it with just the two of us on the boat. To add a second spinnaker halyard, we need something to attach a block to at the masthead. The only thing we could find were some eye bolts. To insulate those eye bolts from the aluminum mast, I used a little bit of flexible cutting board from IKEA. After having cut the eye bolts to length using the trusty old ankle grinder, it was time to yet again head up the mast. The first time I went up the mast, we used the winches at the base of the mast. After having led the new longer line aft to the cockpit for the second trip up the mast, we could use the electric winch, which made the trip up the mast much quicker. While I was up the top of the mast, I had a good opportunity to check everything. I replaced the old spinnaker halyard block with a new one and also secured the cable for the wind instrument. Back on the ground, we flaked out the anchor chain on the pontoon to give it a good wash and also to paint on some new chain markers. After a good scrubbing and some time to dry, Julian and Mark set to work spraying the chain with yellow spray paint. The yellow paint on the chain is only the first step. A little bit later today, the hardworking paint crew will have to come back and apply some red paint also. But why paint the chain when we've got that electronic chain counter? Some of you might recall that we installed a chain counter on our Low France Tigris windlass. Now when we installed it, it seemed to work fine, but for instance when we flaked out all of the chain here, and I know for a fact that we have 100 meters worth of chain, The chain counter said that we'd put out 200 and some odd meters of chain. That means either the chain counter is not super reliable, or our chain has started reproducing and multiplying in the chain logger, which would be awesome. I just think it's a little bit more likely that the chain counter is not super reliable. Anywho, I got one more thing taken care of here in the cockpit. I made a couple of Dyneema loops. There's one here on our second main sheet, and then there's one here on this block for the spinnaker. They just serve the purpose of moving the blocks to somewhere where they're more convenient to have. Like for instance, this one with the loop on there, it clears the cockpit coaming and the winches and stuff. And yeah, this one also just gets positioned so that we can route the sheet back to a winch. Because Athena is only 38 feet long, there's a little bit of a lack of good bunks for sleeping in while underway. We're gonna have one crew member sleeping over here on the settee, one in the aft cabin. Those are both really good places to sleep. And then one up on the floor here in the forward cabin. The only downside to sleeping on the settee is that you're kind of in the middle of the living room. So if the other two crew members are cooking or moving about in here, it might be nice for the crew member that's sleeping on the settee to be able to just relocate into the forward cabin. Last week I made sure that the door to the forward cabin can physically close, but there's nothing to keep the door closed. And if there's a crew member that would like to sleep in there during the day, well, it'd be nice to be able to close it to give them some peace and quiet. We already have the door handle here ready to go. This is the same type of door handle we've got on the head. The only thing that's been keeping me back from installing it on the door to the forward cabin is a lack of a striker plate. Now, I found this striker plate here on the island, but it's kind of the wrong size and shape. As you can see, one of the previous owners made some kind of repair to the door frame here. Now this is where the old striker plate was mounted. I'm going to mount the door handle without a striker plate. That's going to cause a little bit of damage to the door frame, but that damage is going to get covered up by the new striker plate when we get our hands on it. My swashbuckling crew is out on a little bit of a supply run right now, so to keep the door closed while I find the exact location of the door handle, I'll use a little bit of tape. That looks about right to me. Right now there's about 4 millimeters worth of material here. When I get the correct striker plate, I can move that a little bit further aft, but for now I will have to compensate for the 4 millimeters. We are squarely in the realm of a cruiser's fix here, but the 4 little pieces of flexible cutting board from IKEA should do the trick. I've marked the position of the door handle hole here, so now we just need a hole for the door handle, and then we should be able to put everything together. So far, so good. Now we just need to chop a little bit off of this guy so that the handle can sit flush. And voila, a fully functional door. Now it will be nice to get the striker plate on there so it's truly finished, but at least this way we'll have a door that works for the crossing. Last week I copper coated the rudder for the wind vane. Copper coat is a multi-season anti-fouling. Now after you've applied copper coat and it's cured, you're supposed to activate it by just abrading the surface to expose some of the copper that's encapsulated in the epoxy. I've seen 2 different sets of instructions. One called for abrading the surface with a Scotch-Brite pad, and the other calls for using sandpaper. I've also seen various photos that show the state you're supposed to get your copper coat in, and those are quite different. Now for the hull, I did a very thorough sanding just to make sure we wouldn't end up with a ton of growth, but for the wind vane rudder, it's such a small area, I think we should do a little test and use the Scotch-Brite pad on that. I would say this is as much as I can abrade the surface with a Scotch-Brite pad. Any more than this and I would switch to sandpaper. So let's get this installed and then we'll see how our little test pans out. One of the many things I really like about Athena is our integrated dinghy lifting arch/davit setup, where we can easily lift the dinghy out of the water. It's a lot easier than putting it back up on deck, and it's something I think we'll really enjoy in the Caribbean. With the rudder back in the water, it slid right up the rudder stock. There's a little bolt and a nut that keeps the rudder in place. This is not what's taking the force of the rudder turning, it is simply just keeping the rudder from sliding off of the rudder stock. While I had the dinghy out, I decided to give the last few pieces of stainless that we couldn't reach a quick polish. This stuff is amazing. One quick wipe and any rust spots or discoloration is gone. Meanwhile, the painting crew had returned from their excursion and finished painting the chain markers. It's the next day. The wind has picked up quite a bit. The crew's out seeing if they can get us a fresh bottle of propane in the hopes that we'll catch some fish crossing the Atlantic. Now, while they're gone, I figured I might as well get a little sewing project out of the way. The first sewing project is a fly screen or a mosquito screen for the companionway so we can get some air moving through the boat when we get to the Caribbean. We have a little bit of this mesh material here left over. I think we have enough for the mosquito screen and maybe a couple of smallish rope bags. This is my little test piece here. I doubled over this material a couple of times and put in a snap just to see that the snap is nice and secure before I put it into the real fly screen. And also this is a little bit of folded over material to make this just a little bit stiffer. Hopefully that little bit of stiffness will mean that we can have the fly screen sit nicely going across the companion here without sagging too much in the middle. This was Mark's idea and I think it's going to work out really well. I've grabbed a couple of quick measurements from the companionway and I've allowed for a little bit of seam allowance, so let's get some material cut. I'll use the edge of the table here to cut a hopefully reasonably square piece. Unfortunately, it turns out we are just a tiny bit short on the material, so we'll have some non-planned, slightly artsy corners here. As you can see, this is cut. To make this seem like it's on purpose, I think we'll just repeat that over here on the other side. It'll just be a slightly tapered bottom. There we go. Tapered bottom, totally on purpose. Ava's little clippy thingies here are coming in super useful. I don't really fancy using basting tape for this because it is a mesh, so it's just going to end up being a sticky mess. After a little bit of sewing, we've now got the basic shape of the mosquito net, so it's gonna look something like that. It looks like Mark's idea of folding the material over so it becomes a little bit more rigid is working. Now I just have to fold over the bottom here. I was gonna hold off on doing that just to make sure that I got it the right length. To get this thing to stay put even when it is blowing, I picked up some snaps at the local chandlery. Provided we have some screws that I can use with these, we can go ahead and get this installed. So something that can sit inside of this guy and is not a mile long. The scavenger hunt has yielded 4 really good screws and this bag of some that might be on the smaller side, but these are not really going to be holding a lot, so I think it'll be okay. I have never installed anything with snaps before, but I figured it might be a good idea to make some holes with the hole punch. That way I can mark the position of the male part of these snaps up on the hatch cover. Ta-da! Right now it is just held in place by the 4 snaps. I'm gonna hold off on adding the rest of the snaps until I have the right screws. I think this will work fine until we get those. To help organize lines and other stuff, I decided to make some simple little bags from some of our scrap mesh and canvas. And ta-da! 3 bags. 2 of them are completely made out of mesh material. Those are for lines. The third one is made out of canvas and a little bit of mesh in the bottom. This is for all of my splicing tools and loose bits of Dyneema. So for instance, our second main sheet here can get its very own little bag. That is a very nice and tidy way of storing that. I think that's well worth the couple of hours it took to make all these 3 bags. The paint on the chain should have fully dried now, so we can go ahead and get that back into the chain locker. Now the paint scheme on the chain is the brainchild of Mark, so why don't we let him introduce himself real quick, and he can tell you what the marking scheme is.
Hi, I'm Mark and I'm just here to help Mads get the boat across to the Caribbean. I'll go into a little bit about my background later on. Just for now, I want to show you how we do these chain markings. This marking system is a system we've used in the military, in the Navy, in Navy diving. So each 3 meter length has a yellow mark, and every 3 meters you go down, increases the number of yellow marks. So first 3 meters 1 mark, second 3 meters two yellow marks, until you get to 15 meters when you have 1 red mark. And then you go 1 red mark and 1 yellow mark for 18 meters, the 15 added to the 3. It is nice to know how much you've got the chain going down when you're anchoring, but more importantly when you're weighing anchor. If you've got a foul anchor, it's nice to know at what water depth it's fouled at, and also if you're anchoring in a confined anchorage where there's lots of boats, you can really then control how much chain you got out.
Mark and I got the chain stuffed back in the chain locker. We're planning on leaving tomorrow. It looks like in terms of weather routing, this passage is going to be pretty interesting because there's some stuff blowing through a little bit south of here, which means we're probably going to end up going a little bit further north than you typically would leaving the Canaries. But we'll get back to that in next week's video. Please cross your fingers for fair winds and following seas. On that hopeful note, I hope to see all of you guys back here aboard Athena next week for copious amounts of sailing fun and my first ever Atlantic crossing. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!